And good morning, everybody. My name is Bassam Lazad. I'm a consultant for UNEP. Welcome and thank you for attending this special UNEP session at this conference. UNEP is the United Nations Environmental Program, and UNEP and ASHRAE have a cooperation which was signed recently. The cooperation on education, on the spreading of tools and educational material. And this session is in the spirit of this cooperation. Today we have 4 speakers, and they come from different parts of, or different, let's say, portions of the industry. We have a person with us from UNEP. We have a speaker from the IMO, the International Maritime Organization, a speaker from ASHRAE, and finally a speaker from UNEDO. And this session will also extend after lunch. So as an introduction, our first speaker is Ms. Artie Dubrie. She is a UNEP network coordinator for the Pacific Island countries of the Montreal Protocol Compliance Assistance Program, or CAP as it's known. She's from Trinidad and Tobago, but she's based in Bangkok, and she will be talking to us via Skype today. She couldn't be with us, but hopefully the Skype will help us go through this presentation. And she's currently supporting the Pacific Island countries to meet and sustain the Montreal Protocol obligations. And the Pacific Island countries, there's a lot of fishing, and that's why you will see that there is a focus or a concentration on the fisheries section in this session. So with this, we can put Ms. Artie on. Go ahead.
Can I start now?
Yes, you may proceed.
Good. Okay, well, good afternoon everyone from Bangkok, and good morning to the participants and delegates at Athens. Again, apologies on behalf of the United Nations Environmental Program for not being there in person, but I'm sure that we will be able to give you the best delivery of the knowledge that we are imparting in this session, as we bring together a very important subject of how are we managing ozone depleting substances and the refrigeration and air conditioning sector in its widest sense as required under the Montreal Protocol. Thank you, Mr. Bassam, for the introduction. Yesterday we had a meeting of environmental ministers for the Asia Pacific, and the Minister of Tonga says that the Pacific region is 98% ocean. So there's a lot of fish in there and a lot of shipping. So it's a good place to be to learn and to understand the subject of refrigeration technology in the shipping and fishing sector. So just to give a profile of my presentation, if I can get the slides moving. Dimitris, I am not moving my slides. Okay. So my presentation overview, we will give a phase out of the ozone depleting substances and the implication to the marine shipping and fishing sector. What are the rules of the Montreal Protocol on the phase out of ozone depleting substances as it can apply to the shipping and fishing sector? The challenges for developing, and I would say also the more developed country, as we address the phase out of this controlled substance in the fishing and the shipping sector, and a few recommendations on the way forward. However, I know that you are the experts, and therefore you may have much more to share on how we can, as an international community, address this global common. Now, under the Montreal Protocol for the phase-out of ozone-depleting substances, at the 20th meeting of the parties to the protocol, the parties agree to the phasing out of these controlled substances, and in particular, the 8 CFCs, or as commonly known, the R22s. The purpose of this decision resulted in a significant reduction in the ozone depleting or the ozone depletion of our stratospheric ozone layer. And of course, many of the chemicals that deplete the ozone layer are also carrying very high global warming potential. So it's the win-win decisions that the party took, addressing both the depletion of the ozone layer, or the control in the depletion of the ozone layer, as well as removing from our atmosphere very harmful and substances that are carrying very high global warming potential. Now, in the next slide, give you just a brief on what the parties agreed to with the different schedules between the developed countries and the developing countries. Now, under the Montreal Protocol, the more developed countries are referred to as the Article 5 countries, the non-Article 5 countries, sorry, and this is a schedule that was agreed to for the more developed country. Now you will see from this, as of this year, the one highlighted in pink, that as of January 1st, 2015, the more developed country would have had to reduce their consumption level by 90%, with a total phase-out by 2020, and allowing only a small amount of use for the servicing. Now, in the next slide, I go to the developing countries, and you would see that the developing countries, and if we focus on the pink line again, the developing countries, we have a much more longer period in which to meet our schedules, starting with only a 10% reduction in this year and taking us until 2030 for a complete phase out. So if I go to the next slide, it gives you this comparative as of this year. So this year, if we look at the developed country, 90% reduction is mandated from the protocol, and for the developing country, 10%. Now, I prepared this slide in a very deliberate way because when we talk about the fishing and shipping sector, the sovereignty of where the use is not as clear as if we were dealing with land-based system. The fishing and the shipping sector moves, as a vessel can move between a developed and developing country as the needs arise and as the vessel has to be in operation. And therefore, this consumption between developed and developing country, the percentage reduction as it relates to the obligation of the state, is never clearly addressed in the shipping and the fishing sector working on the international waters. And for this reason, in the discussion with our colleagues in ASHRI, we felt that having this session in the context of this meeting is extremely important to bring into fore the complexity and the challenges of phasing out the controlled substances in an industry that moves at any moment between developed and developing countries, and at the same time getting their supplies of the controlled substance from the various ports, which could be ports of developed or ports of developing country. So having laid that issue, I felt that as I go through my presentation, I would request that you ponder on this challenge of how are we to manage the controlled substance between the developed and developing country, and especially with respect to how do we support the member state in meeting their compliance obligations. Now, this slide, and this slide is to wake you up before lunch, just to give you a documented and reported consumption of the controlled substance, and we are talking specifically about 8 CFCs, and the consumption between the developing countries and the more developed countries. So if we take, for example, the green line, the green line would be our developing countries. So for example, the European communities, the countries in the European community, this is where you have to meet your schedules for reduction, and the solid green line will show that you are well reducing your consumption of the controlled substance. However, if you see the developing country, for most part, you will see that there is an upward trend. So there is a variation on what is happening with the developing country, which is red, and the developed country, which is green, in terms of their obligations and the reported amount of chemicals that are used between the more developed and the developing countries. And again, if you try to reflect this on the mobile shipping and fishing sector, you can then see the complexity on how the complexity and the challenge for the management of data between developed and developing countries. Now, for the fishing and shipping sector, the question is, where would you be using these controlled substances? The major sector, of course, would be your air conditioning refrigeration sector as refrigerant, and the primary one as controlled under the Montreal Protocol would be your HCFCs. The other use can be depending on the vessel and depending on what the vessel is used for. You have, as built in as foams and insulation material. For those vessels that could be cargo vessels, you may be using methyl bromide during your plant quarantine and pre-shipment processes. Sometimes we find that technicians will be using the R141B and the flushing of tubes and lines, and of course possible as a combination in your HCFC fire extinguishers. Just to summarize, where the main and the bulk use will be is in the air conditioning and refrigeration sector. Now, the question therefore will follow, well, what are the consumption levels in the fishing and the shipping sector? We found that the data that is available does not give you sufficient knowledge to say, well, what is the percentage, or how is the air conditioning refrigeration inventory in the fishing and shipping sector? What are the demarcations for those that are still dependent on HCFCs? The data, of course, is available on the size of vessels and the type of vessels that are refrigerated, and that we can then perhaps extrapolate on those vessels that might be still dependent on HCFCs. Now, under the Montreal Protocol, we have a committee called the Technical and Economic Assessment Panel. And the Technical and Economic Assessment Panel, based on their report of last year, estimate that the majority of vessels, and these are vessels that are working at the international level, are still dependent on HCFCs. So they estimate that 80% of the marine vessels are still dependent on the controlled substance under the Montreal Protocol. Most of the vessels, of course, are very large vessels, with the fishing vessels having the larger inventories of the controlled substance because of the nature of the operation. Because, of course, the climatic conditions and the movements that occur in the open ocean, the committee reported that the leakages in fishing vessels can be up to 40%. With various levels of emission depending on the type of technologies. So to go back to the age of the vessels that are known to be built with R22 systems, this data will show the age of the vessels that are still dependent on R22. And these are perhaps a lot of the vessels that are fishing vessels working in the waters of the Pacific. Now, this is the data I got from the Pacific Island Fisheries Forum Agency on the vessels in their waters, not necessarily registered to developing countries. They could be carrying the flags of a developing country, but with the owner perhaps from one of the more developed countries. But the majority of vessels built between 1980 and 2000 were built on R22. And of course, there's no easy changeover from an R22 to the other technologies that are required to keep the fish catch in the condition that can go onto the market. So we estimate that the vessels that are built between 1980 into 2000 are still based on HCFCs, and a very good chance that they will be working in the waters of the the developing countries. Now, in the control required under the Montreal Protocol, the Montreal Protocol, as parties to the Montreal Protocol, require that each party give or establish an import-export licensing system on all controlled substances. So whether you're a developed or a developing country, you are required to provide your data on import and export of this controlled substance, if there was a recovery, recycle, production, destruction, etc. The question remains is how is this data received from the, and I call the word nebulous, fishing and shipping sectors. We have been very efficient in getting data from land-based systems or importation that goes through a customs division and with the customs officers having access to this data. For the fishing and the shipping sector that's working in international waters, this data is not available. So going back to where the Technical and Economic Assessment Panel is saying that 80% of the vessels are still based on R22, and bringing it back to this file where we're saying that we need data from the fishing and shipping sector, that relationship from a data analysis perspective, we still need to get that data. It's not available. So the implication to the fishing and shipping sectors, as I've said, the challenge is the cross-boundary operation of vessels, the relationship of flag states and the owner of the vessel. In the Pacific, we have a lot of chartered vessels, and of course the Montreal Protocol obligation in the management of these controlled substances as they are required by each individual parties. Now, the last bullet point on this is that for developing countries, there is a fund mechanism that we refer to as the Montreal Protocol Multilateral Fund. And this fund mechanism supports all developing countries to assist them in their phase-out schedule. To be able to access this funding, we need to have data. And again, I will repeat, data as for a member state consumption amount for the fishing and the shipping sector is still not yet available. The continuation of the Montreal Protocol enforcement controls, we have the rules and regulations, and my colleague from the International Maritime Organization will give much more detail on the rules and responsibilities for the marine environment from a legislative point of view. So I just list a few of these marine responsibilities from a legislative point of view, and how can we get data to be able to feed into the requirement of the Montreal Protocol. So owner state, flag state, port state, charter state, etc., which does not happen in land-based system. In a land-based system, it comes through customs, and we are able to get that data. However, in the marine sector, you're dealing with so many other mechanisms in which data is to be collected, and that gives into the complexity and the inability to date on getting substantive data so that we can make decisions on how we can support the phase out of these controlled substances in the marine industry. The sources of data, the traditional that I said have always been through customs, through local vessels, the flag vessels. Now, just as I stop on the flag vessels working in international waters, the parties to the Montreal Protocol, especially the European Union representing member states, have been asking for a decision on the interpretation of the use of ozone-depleting substances in flag vessels. To date, there is no decision on the Montreal Protocol on how parties should report the supply of ozone-depleting substances to flag vessels. The European Union has very, very strong legislation and enforcement mechanisms on the supply of ozone-depleting substances to flag vessels, and therefore we do get data from the European Union on when, for example, a flag of Kiribati goes on to a dock in Spain to get servicing and may require R22. So the European Union will report that as an export to Kiribati. But many other states do not give that report on when a vessel comes to their respective waters for repairs and services and subsequently the supply of the controlled substance. And there could be other relationships on how a flag vessel works. And again, I would say my colleagues from the IMO will give more detail on how this relationship is done under the rules of the International Maritime.
Artie, 5 minutes, please.
Okay, so just thank you very much, Bassem. So the implications to the fishing sector, we have the global phase-out, the reduced availability of HCFCs as per the requirements of the Montreal Protocol, and the socioeconomic implication on the phasing out of this controlled substance. My last bullet point to this, of course, will show that for the Pacific region, you would see that 2.2 million tons of fish is caught in 2013, and with an estimated market value of 6.3 billion. Therefore, if we are addressing the phasing out of ozone-depleting substance, we need to consider the socioeconomic implication to the developing countries and perhaps owners of vessels that are working in this region. Now, I mentioned also the R22 and the reported case of R40. And this is actually one of the growing trend with illegal trade, because when there is a demand, there is also the risk of illegal trade of the controlled substance. And we have now as an illegal substance being sold as R134A, which is the R40, and there are many documentations of accidents and officers being killed as a result of this illegal substance, which is methyl chloride, being substituted for R40. And as you will see, for the containers that were in explosion because of the use of R40, And so another issue is on the safety of the refrigerants that are on the market, and particularly the illegally traded refrigerants, and in this case the R40. So as to conclude, we will need a coordinated mechanism between all stakeholders in the industry, both at the national as well as the international level. My other slide is, and I'm going very quickly to be able to get the time in. We have to look at the IUU, the unregulated fishing, illegal and unregulated and unreported fishing sector, because this is also one of the big challenges in the marine sector, and our view is that the management of the trade of refrigerant will be a key vehicle in allowing us to give some sort of support in the illegal unregulated fishing, as we know that if there is no refrigerant, there is no fishery. So if we can control the trade and the supply of refrigerant in a much more systematic manner and perhaps legal manner, we can actually help in the providing data to decision makers on the unregulated and illegal fishing. So suggested way forward, we need to know our vessels, refrigeration type, the age, etc. We need to know who the stakeholders are in the various sectors. We need to have good data on the type of refrigerants and where there is HCFCs, how are we converting to the alternatives and what are the mechanisms required? And clearly, we need to have an agreed public sector mechanism to address the supply and demand for this controlled substance. We need to have to lead the policy, legislation, and training in both the developed and the developing country. So I thank you very much for your attention, and I now pass you back to the moderator for his management. Thank you very much, everyone.